So your next assignment pertains to taking photographs of objects and putting them into a space that they've never existed in before. Um, in the last lecture, I outlined different ways that you can incorporate an image from one photo into a backdrop of some other kind, and how lighting and how it interacts with the environment, casting a shadow, that sort of thing, all comes into play. So you should have a good handle on how to make a selection of, say, a person, a soldier, an object, mask it out of its original environment and put it into a new one. Now, if you choose to use, one of the lasso tools or the pen tool, that aspect of it doesn't, that's a personal preference. But the next goal is these are intended to be statues. The assignment that you're working on, you want it to look like an actual statuary. So there's a couple different ways that we can go about doing that. I'm going to cover how that can be done with maybe like a stone type of texture, as well as like a metallic sort of texture. So with stone, and I'll open up some examples of stone that I downloaded. All of these examples, and I picked different kinds of stone. This one looks like a coarse sandstone. This one's more of like a marble. This is another texture. The issue with all of these, if you just overlay it on a picture, chances are better than not that it's going to still appear relatively flat. And you want to have you want it to look like an object has been carved out of that texture, or out of that type of surface that you've got. So what we're going to do is, it's called a displacement map. And essentially what a displacement map is you're making a copy of a duplicate copy file of a black and white version of an image, and then wrapping a shape or another image around it. As an example, just to sort of give you an idea of the process and a good visual of how this can appear, I'll go ahead and place in like a satin sort of texture. The reason I'm picking this particular texture, this visual image, is you can see that the texture of the fabric, it ripples. There's a lot of folds, there's a lot of highlights and shadows, and it's really clearly conveying that there's a lot of volume. This isn't a flat image. This is something that is round and has folds and creases and shadows and highlights. So keeping in mind, when you search for your reference material, you want to try and find as clean and crisp an image with enough variety of lights and darks as possible in order for it to look as three-dimensionally round as you can. So to turn this satin image into a displacement map, first what I want to do is I'm going to desaturate it, because I want to deal just with the black and whites, but I'm also going to bring up the brightness and the contrast a little bit. So what I want is a nice range. I don't necessarily need the whitest white and the blackest black, but I need to show that there's a good range of grays in between, because those grays are what are going to indicate to the shape that we displace that it needs to wrap and fold around a surface. So the shadows are what's showing that. If an image is too light or too dark, you're not going to get the same visual effect. So I'm going to pick about there, and I'm going to save this as a displacement PSD. So I'm just going to write fabric displace. There we go, fabric displace. And I'm going to save it to my desktop. It has to be a Photoshop document in order for it to function as a displacement map. So what the layers are doing doesn't really matter, but for whatever reason, PSD is what it needs. So I'm going to click Save. I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to back up in my history at this point. I don't necessarily need these now that I've saved my displacement layer. So I'm going to bounce back up in my history to where it's in color. Now, I could put anything on here, but something that I think will really be visibly apparent is I'm going to just type some text over the fabric. That is big. I'll type the word satin because that's what we're dealing with here. And I'm going to put the word right over some of these folds. Okay, so I've got a lot of folds moving up this way. There's one moving this way. There's a little piece that goes behind the T like this. So I'm going to take my text in this instance, and I'm going to displace the text so that it looks like the text is almost written on the fabric and moves with the surface of the fabric. So I've got my text layer selected. Go up to Filter, Distort, Displace. Okay, it will warn you ahead of time that the layer will need to be rasterized. So if you're dealing with smart objects, same thing. You can't displace a smart object, so you would need to duplicate it and rasterize it in order for it to be displaceable. So I'll say OK. It opens up the Displace window. Horizontal and vertical scale, what happens is when something is displaced, it's like moved up and over a little bit to kind of help stretch it around the way that the surface thinks it's going to work. So I'm going to leave it at 5 and 5. I can always go back and change it if I need to. Stretch to fit, you want to make sure that's the option. And repeat edge pixels pertains to the displacement map layer that we made as well. So I'll hit OK. And I'm going to pick my Fabric Displace PSD. And I'll click Open. And it's subtle. I'm going to bounce between the two, but you see how the text just slightly shifts. If I want it to have a more drastic appearance, I could choose to displace it again. See, and the most recent filter used is going to pop up, so I could keep doing that, and it's going to distort it a little more and a little bit more until you're happy with it. Now you can really see the T is really starting to do something kind of wacky there. And Command F is the the continue to do, so I could keep hitting Command F until it warps, till I'm happy with it. Now you can really start to see as I continue to displace how it is warping the text, and it might not be as apparent until I maybe try to set it into the fabric. Let's see here. Here we go. So soft light, you see how it's starting to look like it's actually a part of the fabric where all the shadows dip in and all of the highlight areas bulge out? That's what we're going for. We're going for the texture that we put on these statuary that we're going to be designing. They need to have the proper texture that's going to work with the surface that we're dealing with. So bounce back to a new document here. So I'll pick a picture of a person, place. I found a nice black and white image of George Clooney. I don't have any particular love for George Clooney. That just happened to be a really good image that I found that I'd like to use. I'll rotate my image here. Rotate my canvas. All right, so I want to just deal with George Clooney and not his backdrop. So I'm actually going to use my magic wand to select everything other than him. So I'm just selecting the background. I'll make an extra selection here to invert. And I'll select the top and the bottom too. There we go. So I have everything except George Clooney selected. I'm going to invert my selection. So now George Clooney is the only thing selected and nothing else. I'll duplicate my layer because I can't work on a smart object. And I'll rasterize my layer of George Clooney and mask him. There we are. So now he's just a floating head. Now, if this image needed any tweaking, it's got a lot of good contrast, so I don't really feel like I need to tweak it that much. But if I wanted to, I could do the same process that I did with the fabric, where I could tweak the brightness and the contrast. If I make them too bright, and in photography this is considered blown out, that means you're starting to lose the texture. That's going to make it very difficult. If it's too dark, same problem. So I'm going to leave him as it is, but keep in mind when you're looking for reference images, if it's too bright, that's not going to work very well. And if it's too dark, same thing. You're going to have issues. All right, so I'll delete this. I'll save this as George's Displace. Save. All right, so same concept. I want to turn George into stone here. Place. And we'll say I want to turn George into marble. So I've got my marble texture here. I'm going to fit it to the size that I need. Okay. I'm going to mask, or actually before I do anything, I'm going to duplicate my layer. I'm going to hide the stone that I'm not using, rasterize the top one. Now with the layer that I want to contort, filter, distort, displace. If you used displace recently and I click that, it's going to pick the displace from the fabric. So you want to displace, make sure that you displace new. So distort, displace, horizontal scale 5, I'll say yes. Let's find George Displace 1, open. Now you can see it shifts just a touch. It doesn't look like it's going to make a big difference. But now, I'll add the mask to the selection. I will mask it so it's in the shape of his head. And we will go to multiply. So I'll zoom in a little bit. So the texture of this particular stone is pretty subtle, but if you want to continue to tweak the displacement, Command F or Control F. And you can actually start to see it popping outside of his silhouette as it gets altered. So in certain instances, you might have to redo the mask. But if you want to see the difference between the original and what was there, you can see how certain areas are starting to warp quite a bit. I'll reload him as a selection, remask, turn him back on. If you decide, you know, I'm not really so sure about that particular metal, that's fine. You can bring in, or metal, that particular stone, that's fine. Let's try this one. It's a nice big one. Duplicate. Because it's the same backdrop, because we're still dealing with George, I can just click displace. Open. You can see how some of the stuff started to shift a little bit. And I'll displace a little bit again before I mask this time. Oh, come Come on. And you can see how it's starting to shift, especially, and a good rule of thumb if you're really not sure if it's working, look where a shape starts to turn. Like, see his nose is, there's a slight shadow of his nose right here, and this little piece is starting to curve. So if you're not sure if it's functioning, look where there is some transition along the edges, and you will start to see how those marks are starting to fit into especially the darker areas. Oops. Helps if I'm on the right layer. There we go. This is also how people give people fake tattoos using Photoshop. If I wanted to give George Clooney a tattoo, teardrops on my good. Say I want to give him a teardrop tattoo. It's corny, I know, but it could be. That is a big teardrop. Face. I'll want to edit out the white areas, obviously. Just hit delete in this case. I'll make it larger than it needs to be, but I want it to cover enough surface area so you can see it curve around the side of the face. So I'm going to put it right there. You see how it's not only starting to change shape, but it's fitting into the pores of his skin. That's pretty funny, huh? You can do this on all kinds of things. If you want to just kind of play with the capabilities of displacing an image, pictures of eggs are really good because usually they're smooth and high contrast. This is a perfect image. Not a great size, but it'll get the job done. We'll give the egg a mom tattoo. Just because this last one's a little bit for fun, I'm not going to open it at the file size that I need. So obviously this is only, 2.5 inches by 1 and 1.6. So desaturate. Maybe raise the brightness a tiny bit. place. Rasterize layer. Delete the white space. Shrink it to fit. I love that multiply filter just because it really picks up the texture so well without you having to do any work. It blends in with the shadows and picks up whatever's happening on the surface. And then if you wanted to, distort it further, that's a great opportunity to use like the liquefy option as well. But I think you guys get the idea. Let's go back to, where's George? I'll get rid of his goofy little tattoo. All right, so we've dealt with surface treatments, and you can actually, I'm combining more than one together here. He could even still have his tattoo if you want. So there's the subtle and the speckled stone textures. So those work also. But let's say you're wanting to do something that looks more like chrome or perhaps like a bronze, like some sort of textured metal that's maybe shiny. In certain instances, especially like if you're using like a patinaed metal, think Statue of Liberty. A patina is like a tarnish on a metal. All right, and it can look like a lot of different things. Like rust is considered a patina. That funky green color that's on the Statue of Liberty, this is just what happens when the elements and the metal react and create some sort of surface treatment. Now, if you're doing something along those lines, an image is probably going to be the best way to work, just like the stone that we were doing. But if you want something that's reflective, something that looks like chrome or aluminum, that maybe has variances with the surface, there's actually a very simple way to get this end result without a lot of complicated overlayering. And one way to do that is to play with the curves of an image. So I'm going to create a curves adjustment layer. And by default, it's going to affect the lights and the darks by using this line. And this is very similar. If some of you recall some of the layer adjustments that we got to play with in the last assignment with bevel and emboss, it functions very similar to this, except it controls highlights and shadows. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this little slider over till it hits sort of that arc. I don't want to deal with too much low quality down here. All right. Then I'm going to grab this point and raise it. Now it looks like I've erased his head. I haven't done that. I'm going to be tweaking the way that I'm going to be working with the light. He's still there. It's just I've reduced the number of darks that are visible. So now I'm dragging basically a bump in that line. I don't want it to flatten out on the bottom. I don't want it to flatten like it is here. I'm just wanting to play with the arcs. And you can see that some of the highlights in his skin, I'm going to do quite a bit of play work here. You can see how certain areas are starting to look highly reflective. Now, if I play with it too much, I'm getting sort of an inverse here. That's not really what I want. So you may have to play with your use of these points. And I'm just clicking and dragging, you know, there's no formula. Every image is going to use this sort of method differently. If there's a point that you decide you don't want to use, you can hit delete and it will remove that point, just like if you're dealing with paths or the magnetic lasso tool. But you can see in certain areas it's really starting to have almost like a chrome sort of appearance. So it's really ultimately about trying to find a good mid-range. I'm just trying to make his eyes not glow now. Now you see how I've got a flat spot here and a flat spot here and a flat spot here? I want to avoid the flat spots as much as I can. And if you decide, oh, I really hate the way this looks, this little guy resets the whole thing. Let's try it from the opposite. Okay, so that darkened the backdrop. Still got the lights and the darks. You can see it's starting to look like pebbled metal, especially like his ear right there. That's looking pretty cool. If I want this to just affect him, not the backdrop, clipping mask as usual, or you can mask his head. If I want to make him not look like chrome, but maybe make him look like bronze, same as colorizing a black and white image. Colorize, maybe figure out what that bronze color needs to be. You could even potentially overlay some of the stone with it to make it look like it's weathered in a sense. And again, because we're doing this as an adjustment layer, you can go back and tweak it. If you decide you really don't like the way something looks, you want to lighten it, you want to darken it, you've got tons of opportunities. There are also, and I'll switch back to the photo of him for this, additional options. Let's take a look at the filter gallery real quick. And this is going to change the original photo of him. Some filters will actually soften and give sort of a textural surface shift. So if you are looking for something that looks like stone, but maybe you don't want the same amount of detail that was in the original photo, and this happened to be very thick, you know, very sharp image, some of these combined can help it look a little bit more sculptural. I wouldn't recommend a ripple, just because that tends to undo some of the detail. But there could be this as an option also. And there are a lot of different combinations. It's just some are going to look better than others. I'll cancel out of this. You could also consider a soft blur just on the surface of his face. You see how that starts to make it look a little bit more like metal also? And then you can control the radius and the threshold, which will affect how, there we go, metallic. It looks like the liquid metal guy from from Terminator. So you can really get a lot of interesting effects just by playing with the surface quality. And then compare it to the original. So I'm looking forward greatly to seeing some of the stuff that you guys, have planned. Just a reminder, please check in with me sometime between now and next week so that we can, or I can make sure that, the concept is solid and you're on the right track and, you have a lot of creative freedom. I just want to make sure that Ron is pleased with the end product. He is super excited that you all are taking part in his vision. So, so please let me know if you have any questions. If there are any big ones in class this evening, I'll do a secondary video to help address some of that Q&A. Best of luck.